Part 4 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education, by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Preface. Some Habits of Mind, Some Moral Habits. A Science of Education. Allow me to say once more that I venture to write upon subjects bearing on home education with the greatest deference to mothers, believing that in virtue of their peculiar insight into the dispositions of their own children, they are blessed with both knowledge and power in the management of them which lookers on can only admire from afar. At the same time, there is such a thing as a science of education, that does not come by intuition, in the knowledge of which it is possible to bring up a child entirely according to natural law, which is also divine law, in the keeping of which there is great reward. Education in habit favors an easy life. We have seen why habit, for instance, is such a marvelous force in human life. I find this view of habit very encouraging, as giving a scientific reasonableness to the conclusions already reached by common experience. It is pleasant to know that even in mature life, it is possible, by a little persistent effort, to acquire a desirable habit. It is good, if not pleasant, to know also with what fatal ease we can slip into bad habits. But the most comfortable thing in this view of habit is that it falls in with our natural love of an easy life. We are not unwilling to make efforts in the beginning with the assurance that by and by things will go smoothly, and this is just what habit is in an extraordinary degree pledged to effect. The mother who takes pains to endow her children with good habits secures for herself smooth and easy days, while she who lets their habits take care of themselves has a weary life of endless friction with the children. All day she is crying out, "Do this," and they do it not. "Do that," and they do the other. But, you say, if habit is so powerful whether to hinder or to help the child, it is fatiguing to think of all the habits the poor mother must attend to. Is she never to be at ease with her children? Training in habits becomes a habit. Here again is an illustration of that fable of the anxious pendulum, overwhelmed with the thought of the number of ticks it must tick. But the ticks are to be delivered tick by tick, and there will always be a second of time to tick in. The mother devotes herself to the formation of one habit at a time, doing no more than keep watch over those already formed. If she be appalled by the thought of overmuch labor, let her limit the number of good habits she will lay herself out to form. The child who starts in life with, say, 20 good habits, begins with a certain capital which he will lay out to endless profit as the years go on. The mother who is distrustful of her own power of steady effort may well take comfort in two facts. In the first place, she herself acquires the habit of training her children in a given habit, so that by and by it becomes not only no trouble, but a pleasure to her. In the second place, the child's most fixed and dominant habits are those which the mother takes no pains about, but which the child picks up for himself through his close observation of all that is said and done, felt and thought in his home. Habits inspired in the home atmosphere. We have already considered a group of half-physical habits: order, regularity, neatness, which the child imbibes, so to speak, in this way. But this is not all. Habits of gentleness, courtesy, kindness, candor, respect for other people, or habits quite other than these are inspired by the child as the very atmosphere of his home, the air he lives in and must grow by. End of Part 4, Preface. Some Habits of Mind, Some Moral Habits.
Part 4, Chapter 1 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Witten of WindyHillHomeschool.blogspot.com. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason, Part 4, Chapter 1, The Habit of Attention. Let us pass on now to the consideration of a group of mental habits which are affected by direct training rather than by example. First, we put the habit of attention, because the highest intellectual gifts depend for their value upon the measure in which their owner has cultivated the habit of attention. To explain why this habit is of such extreme importance, we must consider the operation of one or two of the laws of thought. But just recall, in the meantime, the fixity of attention with which the trained professional man, the lawyer, the doctor, the man of letters, listens to a roundabout story, throws out the padding, seizes the facts, sees the bearing of every circumstance, and puts the case with new clearness and method. And contrast this with the wandering eye and random replies of the uneducated, and you see that to differentiate people according to their power of attention is to employ a legitimate test. A mind at the mercy of associations. We will consider, then, the nature and the functions of attention. The mind, with the possible exception of the state of coma, is never idle. Ideas are forever passing through the brain, by day and by night, sleeping or waking, mad or sane. We take a great deal too much upon ourselves when we suppose that we are the authors and intenders of the thoughts we think. The most we can do is to give direction to these trains of thought in the comparatively few moments when we are regulating the thoughts of our hearts. We see in dreams the rapid dance of ideas through the brain during lighter sleep, how ideas follow one another in a general way. In the wanderings of delirium, in the fancies of the mad, the inconsequent prattle of the child, and the babble of the old man, we see the same thing, i.e., the law according to which ideas course through the mind when they are left to themselves. You talk to a child about glass. You wish to provoke a proper curiosity as to how glass is made and what are its uses. Not a bit of it. He wanders off to Cinderella's glass slipper, then he tells you about his godmother who gave him a boat, then about the ship in which Uncle Harry went to America. Then he wonders why you do not wear spectacles, leaving you to guess that Uncle Harry does so. But the child's ramblings are not whimsical. They follow a law, the law of association of ideas, by which any idea presented to the mind recalls some other idea which has been at any time associated with it, as glass and Cinderella's slipper, and that again some idea associated with it. Now this law of association of ideas is a good servant and a bad master. To have this aid in recalling the events of the past, the engagements of the present, is an infinite boon. But to be at the mercy of associations, to have no power to think of what we choose when we choose, but only as something, quote, puts it in our head, end quote, is to be no better than an imbecile. Wandering attention. A vigorous effort of will should enable us at any time to fix our thoughts. Yes, but a vigorous, self-compelling will is the flower of a developed character. And while the child has no character to speak of, but only natural disposition, who is to keep humming tops out of a geography lesson, or a doll's sofa out of a French verb? Here is the secret of the weariness of the home schoolroom. The children are thinking all the time about something else than their lessons. Or rather, they are at the mercy of the thousand fancies that flit through their brains, each in the train of the last. "Oh, Miss Smith," said a little girl to her governess, "there are so many things more interesting than lessons to think about." Where is the harm in this? Not merely that the children are wasting time, though that is a pity, but that they are forming a desultory habit of mind and reducing their own capacity for mental effort. The habit of attention to be cultivated in the infant. The help, then, is not in the will of the child, but in the habit of attention, a habit to be cultivated even in the infant. A baby, notwithstanding his wonderful powers of observation, has no power of attention. In a minute, the coveted plaything drops from listless little fingers, and the wandering glance lights upon some new joy. But even at this stage, the habit of attention may be trained. The discarded plaything is picked up, and with "pretty" and dumb show, the mother keeps the infant's eyes fixed for fully a couple of minutes, and this is his first lesson in attention. Later, as we have seen, the child is eager to see and handle every object that comes in his way. But watch him at his investigations. He flits from thing to thing with less purpose than a butterfly amongst the flowers, staying at nothing long enough to get the good out of it. It is the mother's part to supplement the child's quick observing faculty with the habit of attention. She must see to it that he does not flit from this to that, but looks long enough at one thing to get a real acquaintance with it. Is little Margaret fixing round eyes on a daisy she has plucked? In a second, the daisy will be thrown away, and a pebble or a buttercup will charm the little maid. But the mother seizes the happy moment. She makes Margaret see that the daisy is a bright yellow eye with white eyelashes round it, that all the day long it lies there in the grass and looks up at the great sun, never blinking as Margaret would do, but keeping its eye wide open. And that is why it is called Daisy, day's eye, because its eye is always looking at the sun which makes the day. And what does Margaret think it does at night when there is no sun? It does what little boys and girls do. It shuts up its eye with its white lashes tipped with pink and goes to sleep till the sun comes again in the morning. By this time the daisy has become interesting to Margaret. She looks at it with big eyes after her mother has finished speaking, and then, very likely, cuddles it up to her breast or gives it a soft little kiss. Thus the mother will contrive ways to invest every object in the child's world with interest and delight. Attention to things. Words a weariness. But the tug-of-war begins with the lessons of the schoolroom. Even the child who has gained the habit of attention to things finds words a weariness. This is a turning point in the child's life and the moment for the mother's tact and vigilance. In the first place, never let the child dawdle over copybook or sum. Sit dreaming with his book before him. When a child grows stupid over a lesson, it is time to put it away. Let him do another lesson as unlike the last as possible, and then go back with freshened wits to his unfinished task. If mother or governess have been unwary enough to let the child moon over a lesson, she must just exert her wits to pull him through. The lesson must be done, of course, but must be made bright and pleasant to the child. Lessons attractive. The teacher should have some knowledge of the principles of education, should know what subjects are best fitted for the child considering his age, and how to make these subjects attractive. Should know, too, how to vary the lessons so that each power of the child's mind should rest after effort, and some other power be called into play. She should know how to incite the child to effort through his desire of approbation, of excelling, of advancing, his desire of knowledge, his love of his parents, his sense of duty, in such a way that no one set of motives be called unduly into play to the injury of the child's character. But the danger she must be especially alive to is the substitution of any other natural desire for that of knowledge, which is equally natural, and is adequate for all the purposes of education. Timetable. Definite work in a given time. I shall have opportunities to enter into some of these points later. Meantime, let us look in at a home schoolroom managed upon sound principles. In the first place, there is a timetable written out fairly, so that the child knows what he has to do and how long each lesson is to last. This idea of definite work to be finished in a given time is valuable to the child, not only as training him in habits of order, but in diligence. He learns that one time is not as good as another, that there is no right time left for what is not done in its own time. and this knowledge alone does a great deal to secure the child's attention to his work. Again, the lessons are short, seldom more than 20 minutes in length for children under 8, and this for 2 or 3 reasons. The sense that there is not much time for his sums or his reading keeps the child's wits on the alert and helps to fix his attention. He has time to learn just so much of any one subject as it is good for him to take in at once. And if the lessons be judiciously alternated, sums first, say, while the brain is quite fresh, then writing or reading, some more or less mechanical exercise by way of a rest, and so on, the program varying a little from day to day, but the same principle throughout, a thinking lesson first and a painstaking lesson to follow. The child gets through his morning lessons without any sign of weariness. Even with regular lessons and short lessons, a further stimulus may be occasionally necessary to secure the attention of the child. His desire of approbation may ask the stimulus not only of a word of praise, but of something in the shape of a reward to secure his utmost efforts. Now, rewards should be dealt out to the child upon principle. They should be the natural consequences of his good conduct. A natural reward. What is the natural consequence of work well and quickly done? Is it not the enjoyment of ampler leisure? The boy is expected to do 2 right sums in 20 minutes. He does them in 10 minutes. The remaining 10 minutes are his own, fairly earned, in which he should be free for a scamper in the garden or any delight he chooses. His writing task is to produce 6 perfect M's. He writes 6 lines with only 1 good M in each line. The time for the writing lesson is over, and he has none for himself. Or, he is able to point out 6 good M's in his first line, and he has the rest of the time to draw steamboats and railway trains. This possibility of letting the children occupy themselves variously in the few minutes they may gain at the end of each lesson is compensation which the home schoolroom offers for the zest which the sympathy of numbers and emulation are supposed to give to schoolwork. Emulation. As for emulation, a very potent means of exciting and holding the attention of children, it is often objected that a desire to excel, to do better than others, implies an unloving temper, which the educator should rather repress than cultivate. Good marks of some kind are usually the rewards of those who do best, and it is urged that these good marks are often the cause of ungenerous rivalry. Now, the fact is, the children are being trained to live in the world, and in the world we all do get good marks of one kind or another, prize or praise or both, according as we excel others, whether in football or tennis, or in picture painting or poem making. There are envyings and heart-burnings amongst those who come in second best. So it has been from the beginning, and doubtless will be to the end. If the child is to go out into an emulous world, why, it may possibly be well that he should be brought up in an emulous school. But here is where the mother's work comes in. She can teach her child to be first without vanity, and to be last without bitterness. That is, she can bring him up in such a hearty outgoing of love and sympathy that joy in his brother's success takes the sting out of his own failure, and regret for his brother's failure leaves no room for self-glorification. Again, if a system of marks be used as a stimulus to attention and effort, the good marks should be given for conduct rather than for cleverness. That is, they should be within everybody's reach. Every child may get his mark for punctuality, order, attention, diligence, obedience, gentleness, and therefore marks of this kind may be given without danger of leaving a rankling sense of injustice in the breast of the child who fails. Emulation becomes suicidal when it is used as the incentive to intellectual effort, because the desire for knowledge subsides in proportion as the desire to excel becomes active. As a matter of fact, marks of any sort, even for conduct, distract the attention of children from their proper work, which is in itself interesting enough to secure good behavior as well as attention. Affection as a motive. That he ought to work hard to please his parents who do so much for him is a proper motive to bring before the child from time to time, but not too often. If the mother trade on her child's feelings, if, quote, do this or that to please mother, do not grieve poor mother, end quote, etc., be brought too frequently before the child as the reason for right doing, a sentimental relation is set up which both parent and child will find embarrassing. The true motives of action will be obscured, and the child, unwilling to appear unloving, will end in being untrue. Attractiveness of knowledge. Of course, the most obvious means of quickening and holding the attention of children lies in the attractiveness of knowledge itself, and in the real appetite for knowledge with which they are endowed. But how successful faulty teachers are in curing children of any desire to know is to be seen in many a schoolroom. I shall later, however, have an opportunity for a few words on this subject. What is attention? It is evident that attention is no faculty of the mind. Indeed, it is very doubtful how far the various operations of the mind should be described as faculties at all. Attention is hardly even an operation of the mind, but is simply the act by which the whole mental force is applied to the subject in hand. This act of bringing the whole mind to bear may be trained into a habit at the will of the parent or teacher who attracts and holds the child's attention by means of a sufficient motive. Self-compelled. As the child gets older, he is taught to bring his own will to bear, to make himself attend in spite of the most inviting suggestions from without. He should be taught to feel a certain triumph in compelling himself to fix his thoughts. Let him know what the real difficulty is, how it is the nature of his mind to be incessantly thinking, but how the thoughts, if left to themselves, will always run off from one thing to another, and that the struggle and the victory required of him is to fix his thoughts upon the task in hand. You have done your duty, with a look of sympathy from his mother, is a reward for the child who has made this effort in the strength of his growing will. But it cannot be too much borne in mind that attention is, to a great extent, the product of the educated mind. That is, one can only attend in proportion as one has the intellectual power of developing the topic. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this habit of attention. It is, to quote words of Waite, within the reach of every one, and should be made the primary object of all mental discipline. End quote. For whatever the natural gifts of the child, it is only in so far as the habit of attention is cultivated in him that he is able to make use of them. The secret of overpressure. If it were only as it saves wear and tear, a perpetual tussle between duty and inclination, it is worth while for the mother to lay herself out to secure that her child never does a lesson into which he does not put his heart. And that is no difficult undertaking. The thing is, to be on the watch from the beginning against the formation of the contrary habit of inattention. A great deal has been said lately about overpressure, and we have glanced at one or two of the causes whose effects go by this name. But truly, one of the most fertile causes of an overdone brain is a failure in the habit of attention. I suppose we are all ready to admit that it is not the things we do, but the things we fail to do, which fatigue us, with a sense of omission, with a worry of hurry in overtaking our task. And this is almost the only cause of failure in work in the case of the healthy schoolboy or schoolgirl. Wandering wits hinder a lesson from being fully taken in at the right moment. That lesson becomes a bugbear, continually wanted henceforth and never there, and the sense of loss tries the young scholar more than would the attentive reception of a dozen such lessons. The schoolboy's homework. In the matter of homework, the parents may still be of great use to their boys and girls after they begin to go to day school. Not in helping them, that should not be necessary, But let us suppose a case. Poor Annie does not finish her lessons till 9:30. She really has so much to do. Poor Tom is at his books till 10 o'clock. We never see anything of the children in the evening, say the distressed parents, and they let their children go on in a course which is absolutely ruinous both to bodily health and brain power. Wholesome home treatment for mooning. Now, the fault is very seldom in the lessons, but in the children. They moon over their books, and a little wholesome home treatment should cure them of that ailment. Allow them, at the utmost, an hour and a half for their homework. Treat them tacitly as defaulters if they do not appear at the end of that time. Do not be betrayed into word or look of sympathy. And the moment the time for lessons is over, let some delightful game or storybook be begun in the drawing room. By and by they will find that it is possible to finish lessons in time to secure a pleasant evening afterwards. And the lessons will be much the better done for the fact that concentrated attention has been bestowed on them. At the same time, the custom of giving homework, at any rate to children under 14, is greatly to be deprecated. The gain of a combination of home and school life is lost to the children, and a very full scheme of work may be carried through in the morning hours. Rewards and punishments should be relative consequences of conduct. In considering the means of securing attention, it has been necessary to refer to discipline, the dealing out of rewards and punishments, a subject which every tyro of a nursemaid or nursery governess feels herself very competent to handle. But this too has its scientific aspect. There is a law by which all rewards and punishments should be regulated. They should be the natural, or at any rate, the relative consequences of conduct, should imitate, as nearly as may be without injury to the child, the treatment which such and such conduct deserves and receives in after life. Miss Edgeworth, in her story of Rosamond and the Purple Jar, hits the right principle, though the incident is rather extravagant. Little girls do not often pine for purple jars in chemists' windows, but that we should suffer for our willfulness in getting what is unnecessary by doing without what is necessary is precisely one of the lessons of life we all have to learn, and therefore is the right sort of lesson to teach a child. Natural and educative consequences. It is evident that to administer rewards and punishments on this principle requires patient consideration and steady determination on the mother's part. She must consider with herself what fault of disposition the child's misbehavior springs from. She must aim her punishment at that fault, and must brace herself to see her child suffer present loss for his lasting gain. Indeed, exceedingly little actual punishment is necessary where children are brought up with care. But this happens continually. The child who has done well gains some natural reward, like that 10 minutes in the garden, which the child forfeits who has done less well. And the mother must brace herself and her child to bear this loss. If she equalize the two children, she commits a serious wrong, not against the child who has done well, but against the defaulter, whom she deliberately encourages to repeat his shortcoming. In placing her child under the discipline of consequences, the mother must use much tact and discretion. In many cases, the natural consequence of the child's fault is precisely that which it is her business to avert, while, at the same time, she looks about for some consequence related to the fault which shall have an educative bearing on the child. For instance, if a boy neglect his studies, the natural consequence is that he remains ignorant. But to allow him to do so would be criminal neglect on the part of the parents. End of Part 4, Chapter 1.
Part 4, Chapter 2 of Home Education Series Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 2
The Habits of Application, etc., read by Mary Beth Shaw. Rapid mental effort. The habits of mental activity and of application are trained by the very means employed to cultivate that of attention. The child may plod diligently through his work who might be trained to rapid mental effort. The teacher herself must be alert, must expect instant answers, quick thought, rapid work. The tortoise will lag behind the hare, but the tortoise must be trained to move, every day, a trifle quicker. Aim steadily at securing quickness of apprehension and execution, and that goes far towards getting it. Zeal must be stimulated, so of application. The child must not be allowed to get into the mood in which he says, "Oh, I am so tired of sums," or of history. His zeal must be stimulated. There must always be a pleasing vista before him, and steady, untiring application to work should be held up as honorable, while fitful, flagging attention and effort are scouted. End of Part 4, Chapter 2. Part 4, Chapter 3 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education, by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 3, The Habit of Thinking, read by Mary Beth Shaw. Lion operations included in thinking. The actual labor of the brain is known to psychologists under various names and divided into various operations. Let us call it thinking, which, for educational purposes, is sufficiently exact. But by thinking, let us mean a real conscious effort of mind, and not the fancies that flit without effort through the brain. This sort of thing, for instance, an example quoted by Archbishop Thompson in his Laws of Thought, quote, "When Captain Head was traveling across the pampas of South America, his guide one day suddenly stopped him, and pointing high into the air, cried out, 'A lion!' Surprised at such an exclamation, accompanied with such an act, he turned up his eyes and with difficulty perceived at an immeasurable height a flight of condors soaring in circles in a particular spot. Beneath this spot, far out of sight of himself or guide, lay the carcass of a horse, and over that carcass stood, as the guide well knew, a lion, whom the condors were eyeing with envy from their airy height. The signal of the birds was to him what the sight of the lion alone would have been to the traveler, a full assurance of its existence. Here was an act of thought which cost the thinker no trouble, which was as easy to him as to cast his eyes upward, yet which from us, unaccustomed to the subject, would require many steps and some labor. The sight of the condor convinced him that there was some carcass or other, but as they kept wheeling far above it, instead of swooping down to their feast, he guessed that some beast had anticipated them. Was it a dog or a jackal? No, the condors would not fear to drive away or share with either. It must be some large beast, and as there were lions in the neighborhood, he concluded that one was there." End quote. And all these steps of thought are summed up in the word "a lion." This is the sort of thing that the children should go through more or less in every lesson, a tracing of effect from cause, or of cause from effect, a comparing of things to find out wherein they are alike and wherein they differ, a conclusion as to causes or consequences from certain premises. End of Part 4, Chapter 3.
Part 4, Chapter 4 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Witten, windyhillhomeschool.blogspot.com. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 4, The Habit of Imagining. The sense of the incongruous. All their lessons will afford scope for some slight exercise of the children's thinking power, some more and some less, and the lessons must be judiciously alternated so that the more mechanical efforts succeed the more strictly intellectual, and that the pleasing exercise of the imagination, again, succeed the efforts of reason. By the way, it is a pity when the sense of the ludicrous is cultivated in children's books at the expense of better things. Alice in Wonderland is a delicious feast of absurdities, which none of us, old or young, could afford to spare. But it is doubtful whether the child who reads it has the delightful imaginings, the realizing of the unknown, with which he reads the Swiss Family Robinson. This point is worth considering in connection with Christmas books for the little people. Books of comicalities cultivate no power but the sense of the incongruous. And though life is the more amusing for the possession of such a sense, when cultivated to excess it is apt to show itself in a flippant habit. Diogenes and the naughty boys of Troy is irresistible, but it is not the sort of thing the children will live over and over and play at by the hour, as we have all played at Robinson Crusoe, finding the footprints. They must have funny books, but do not give the children too much nonsense reading. Commonplace tales, tales of imagination. Stories, again, of the Christmas holidays, of George and Lucy, of the amusements, foibles, and virtues of children in their own condition of life, leave nothing to the imagination. The children know all about everything so well that it never occurs to them to play at the situations in any one of these tales, or even to read it twice over. But let them have tales of the imagination, scenes laid in other lands and other times, heroic adventures, hairbreadth escapes, delicious fairy tales in which they are never roughly pulled up by the impossible, even where all is impossible, and they know it, and yet believe. Imagination and great conceptions. And this, not for the children's amusement merely. It is not impossible that posterity may write us down a generation blessed with little imagination, and, by so far, the less capable of great conceptions and heroic efforts, for it is only as we have it in us to let a person or a cause fill the whole stage of the mind, to the exclusion of self-occupation, that we are capable of large-hearted action on behalf of that person or cause. Our novelists say there is nothing left to imagine, and that, therefore, a realistic description of things as they are is all that is open to them. But imagination is nothing if not creative, unless it see not only what is apparent, but what is conceivable, and what is poetically fit in given circumstances. Imagination grows. Now, imagination does not descend full grown to take possession of an empty house. Like every other power of the mind, it is the merest germ of a power to begin with, and grows by what it gets. And childhood, the age of faith, is the time for its nourishing. The children should have the joy of living in far lands, in other persons, in other times, a delightful double existence. And this joy they will find for the most part in their storybooks. Their lessons, too, history and geography, should cultivate their conceptive powers. If the child do not live in the times of his history lesson, be not at home in the climes his geography book describes, why, these lessons will fail of their purpose. But let lessons do their best, and the picture gallery of the imagination is poorly hung if the child have not found its way into the realms of fancy. Thinking comes by practice. How the children's various lessons should be handled so as to induce habits of thinking we shall consider later. But this for the present. Thinking, like riding or skating, comes by practice. The child who has never thought, never does think, and probably never will think. For are there not people enough who go through the world without any deliberate exercise of their own wits? The child must think, get at the reason why of things for himself every day of his life, and more each day than the day before. Children and parents both are given to invert this educational process. The child asks, why? And the parent answers, rather proud of this evidence of thought in his child. There is some slight show of speculation even in wondering why, but it is the slightest and most superficial effort the thinking brain produces. Let the parent ask why, and the child produce the answer, if he can. After he has turned the matter over and over in his mind, there is no harm in telling him, and he will remember it, the reason why. Every walk should offer some knotty problem for the children to think about. Why does that leaf float on the water, and this pebble sink, and so on. End of Part 4, Chapter 4.
Part 4, Chapter 5 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 5, The Habit of Remembering. Read by Boat Harbor, Houston, Texas. Remembering and recollecting. Memory is the storehouse of whatever knowledge we possess, and it is upon the fact of the stores lodged in the memory that we take rank as intelligent beings. The children learn in order that they may remember. Much of what we have learned and experienced in childhood and later we cannot reproduce, and yet it has formed the groundwork of after knowledge. Later notions and opinions have grown out of what we once learned and knew. That is our sunk capital, of which we enjoy the interest, though we are unable to realize. Again, much that we have learned and experienced is not only retained in the storehouse of memory, but is our available capital we can reproduce, recollect upon demand. This memory, which may be drawn upon by the act of recollection, is our most valuable endowment. A spurious memory. There is a third kind of spurious memory, facts and ideas floating in the brain which yet make no part of it, and are exuded at a single effort. As when a barrister produces all his knowledge of a case in his brief and then forgets all about it, or when the schoolboy crams for an examination, writes down what he has thus learned, and behold, it is gone from his gaze forever. As Ruskin puts it, they cram to pass, and not to know. They do pass, and they don't know. That the barrister, the physician, should be able thus to dismiss the case on which he has ceased to be occupied, the publisher the book he has rejected, is well for him, and this art of forgetting is not without its uses. But what of the schoolboy who has little left after a year's work but his place in a class list? Memory a record in the brain's substance. To say anything adequate on the subject of memory is impossible here, but let us try to answer 2 or 3 queries which present themselves on the surface. How do we come to remember at all? How do we gain the power to utilize remembered facts, that is, to recollect? And under what conditions is knowledge acquired that neither goes to the growth of the brain and mind, nor is available on demand, but is lightly lodged in the brain for some short period, and is then evacuated at a single throw? We are interested in a wonderful invention, an instrument which records spoken words, and will deliver, say a century hence, speech or lecture in the very words and in the very tones of the speaker. Such an instrument is that function of the brain called memory, whereby the impressions received by the brain are recorded mechanically. At least, such is the theory pretty generally received now by physiologists. That is, the mind takes cognizance of certain facts, and the nerve substance of the brain records that cognizance. Made under what conditions? Now the questions arise, under what conditions is such an imprint of fact or event made upon the substance of the brain? Is the record permanent? And is the brain capable of receiving an indefinite number of such impressions? It appears both from common experience and from an infinite number of examples quoted by psychologists that any object or idea which is regarded with attention makes the sort of impression on the brain which is said to fix it in the memory. In other words, give an instant's undivided attention to anything whatsoever, and that thing will be remembered. In describing this effect, the common expression is accurate beyond its intention. We say such and such a sight or sound or sensation made a strong impression on me, and that is precisely what has happened. Arrest the attention upon any fact or incident, and that fact or incident is remembered. It is impressed, imprinted upon the brain substance. The inference is plain. You want the child to remember? Then secure his whole attention, the fixed gaze of his mind, as it were, upon the fact to be remembered. Then he will have it, by a sort of photographic process. That fact or idea is taken by his brain, and when he is an old man perhaps, the memory of it will flash across him. Recollection and the law of association. But it is not enough to have a recollection flash across one incidentally. We want to have the power of recalling at will. And for this, something more is necessary than an occasional act of attention producing a solitary impression. Supposing, for instance, that by good teaching you secure the child's attention to the verb avoir, he will remember it. That is to say, some infinitely slight growth of brain tissue will record and retain that one French verb. But one verb is nothing. You want the child to learn French, and for this you must not only fix his attention upon each new lesson, but each must be so linked into the last that it is impossible for him to recall one without the other following in its train. The physical effect of such a method appears to be that each new growth of brain tissue is, so to speak, laid upon the last. That is, to put it figuratively, a certain tract of the brain may be conceived of as being overlaid with French. This is to make a practical use of that law of association of ideas, of which one would not willingly become the sport, and it is the neglect of this law which invalidates much good teaching. The teacher is content to produce a solitary impression, which is only recalled as it is acted upon by a chance suggestion, whereas he should forge the links of a chain to draw his bucket out of the well. Probably the reader may have heard of a Dr. Pick, who grounded a really philosophical system of mnemonics on these two principles of attention and association. Whatever we may think of his application of it, the principle, he asserted, is the right one. Every lesson must recall the last. Let every lesson gain the child's entire attention, and let each new lesson be so interlaced with the last that the one must recall the other. That, again, recalls the one before it, and so on to the beginning. No limit to the recording power of the brain. But the lightly come, lightly go of a mere verbal memory follows no such rules. The child gets his exercise by heart, says it off like a parrot, and behold, it is gone. There is no record of it upon the brain at all. To secure such a record there must be time. Time for that full gaze of the mind we call attention, and for the growth of the brain tissue to the new idea. Given these conditions, there appears to be no limit of quantity to the recording power of the brain, except in this way. A girl learns French and speaks it fairly well. By the time she is a grandmother, she has forgotten it entirely, has not a word left. When this is the case, her French has been disused. She has not been in the habit of reading, hearing, or speaking French from youth to age. Whereby it is evident that, to secure right of way to that record of French imprinted on her brain, the path should have been kept open by frequent goings and comings. But links of association a condition of recollection. To acquire any knowledge or power whatsoever, and then to leave it to grow rusty in a neglected corner of the brain, is practically useless. Where there is no chain of association to draw the bucket out of the well, it is all the same as if there were no water there. As to how to form these links, every subject will suggest a suitable method. The child has a lesson about Switzerland today, and one about Holland tomorrow, and the one is linked to the other by the very fact that the two countries have hardly anything in common. What the one has, the other has not. Again, the association will be of similarity and not of contrast. In our own experience we find that colours, places, sounds, odours recall persons or events. But links of this sensuous order can hardly be employed in education. The link between any two things must be found in the nature of the things associated. End of Part 4, Chapter 5.
Part 4, Chapter 6 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 6, The Habit of Perfect Execution. The habit of turning out imperfect work. Throw perfection into all you do is a counsel upon which a family may be brought up with great advantage. We English as a nation think too much of persons, and too little of things, work, execution. Our children are allowed to make their figures, or their letters, their stitches, their dolls' clothes, their small carpentry, anyhow, with the notion that they will do better by and by. Other nations, the Germans and the French, for instance, look at the question philosophically, and know that if the children get the habit of turning out imperfect work, then men and women will undoubtedly keep that habit up. I remember being delighted with the work of a class of about 40 children of 6 and 7 in an elementary school at Heidelberg. They were doing a writing lesson, accompanied by a good deal of oral teaching from a master, who wrote each word on the blackboard. By and by the slates were shown, and I did not observe one faulty or irregular letter on the whole 40 slates. The same principle of perfection was to be discerned in a recent exhibition of schoolwork held throughout France. No faulty work was shown, to be excused on the plea that it was the work of children. A child should execute perfectly. No work should be given to a child that he cannot execute perfectly, and then perfection should be required of him as a matter of course. For instance, he is set to do a copy of strokes, and is allowed to show a slateful of all the sorts of slopes and all the sorts of intervals. His moral sense is vitiated, his eye is injured. Set him 6 strokes to copy. Let him not bring a slateful, but 6 perfect strokes, at regular distances and at regular slopes. If he produces a faulty pair, get him to point out the fault, and persevere until he has produced his task. If he does not do it to-day, let him go on to-morrow and the next day, and when his 6 perfect strokes appear, let it be an occasion of triumph. So with the little tasks of painting, drawing, or construction he sets himself, let everything he does be well done. An unsteady house of cards is a thing to be ashamed of. Closely connected with this habit of perfect work is that of finishing whatever is taken in hand. The child should rarely be allowed to set his hand to a new undertaking until the last is finished. End of Part 4, Chapter 6.
Part 4, Chapter 7 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 7, Some Moral Habits. Obedience. It is disappointing that in order to cover the ground at all, we must treat these moral habits, which the mother owes it to her children to cultivate in them, in a slight and inadequate way. But the point to be borne in mind is, that all that has been already said about the cultivation of habit applies with the greatest possible force to each of these habits. The whole duty of a child. First, and infinitely the most important, is the habit of obedience. Indeed, obedience is the whole duty of the child, and for this reason every other duty of the child is fulfilled as a matter of obedience to his parents. Not only so obedience is the whole duty of man, obedience to conscience, to law, to divine direction. It has been well observed that each of the 3 recorded temptations of our Lord in the wilderness is a suggestion not of an act of overt sin, but of an act of wilfulness, that state directly opposed to obedience, and out of which springs all that foolishness which is bound up in the heart of a child. Obedience no accidental duty. Now, if the parent realize that obedience is no mere accidental duty, the fulfilling of which is a matter that lies between himself and the child, but that he is the appointed agent to train the child up to the intelligent obedience of the self-compelling, law-abiding human being, he will see that he has no right to forego the obedience of his child, and that every act of disobedience in the child is a direct condemnation of the parent. Also he will see that the motive to the child's obedience is not the arbitrary one of "do this or that because I have said so," but the motive of the apostolic injunction, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Children must have the desire to obey. It is only in proportion as the will of the child is the act of obedience, and he obeys because his sense of right makes him desire to obey, in spite of temptations to disobedience, not of constraint, but willingly, that the habit has been formed which will, hereafter, enable the child to use the strength of his will against his inclinations when these prompt him to lawless courses. It is said that the children of parents who are most strict in exacting obedience often turn out ill, and that orphans and other poor waifs brought up under strict discipline only wait their opportunity to break out into license. Exactly so, because in these cases there is no gradual training of the child in the habit of obedience, no gradual enlisting of his will on the side of sweet service and a free will offering of submission to the highest law. The poor children are simply bullied into submission to the will, that is, the willfulness of another, not at all for it is right, only because it is convenient. Expect obedience. The mother has no more sacred duty than that of training her infant to instant obedience. To do so is no difficult task. The child is still trailing clouds of glory from God, who is his home. The principle of obedience is within him, waiting to be called into exercise. There is no need to rate the child, or threaten him, or use any manner of violence, because the parent is invested with authority which the child intuitively recognizes. It is enough to say, "Do this," in a quiet, authoritative tone, and expect it to be done. The mother often enough loses her hold over her children because they detect in the tone of her voice that she does not expect them to obey her behests. She does not think enough of her position, has not sufficient confidence in her own authority. The mother's great stronghold is in the habit of obedience. If she begin by requiring that her children always obey her, why, they will always do so as a matter of course. But let them once get the thin end of the wedge in, let them discover that they can do otherwise than obey, and a woeful struggle begins, which commonly ends in the children doing that which is right in their own eyes. This is the sort of thing which is fatal. The children are in the drawing room, and a caller is announced. "You must go upstairs now." "Oh, mother dear, do let us stay in the window corner. We will be as quiet as mice." The mother is rather proud of her children's pretty manners, and they stay. They are not quiet, of course, but that is the least of the evils. They have succeeded in doing as they chose, and not as they were bid, and they will not put their necks under the yoke again without a struggle. It is in little matters that the mother is worsted. "Bedtime, Willie." "Oh, mamma, just let me finish this." And the mother yields, forgetting that the case in point is of no consequence. The thing that matters is that the child should be daily confirming a habit of obedience by the unbroken repetition of acts of obedience. It is astonishing how clever the child is in finding ways of evading the spirit while he observes the letter. "Mary, come in." "Yes, mother." But her mother calls 4 times before Mary comes. "Put away your bricks." And the bricks are put away with slow, reluctant fingers. "You must always wash your hands when you hear the first bell." The child obeys for that once, and no more. To avoid these displays of wilfulness, the mother will insist from the first on an obedience which is prompt, cheerful, and lasting, save for lapses of memory on the child's part. Tardy, unwilling, occasional obedience is hardly worth the having, and it is greatly easier to give the child the habit of perfect obedience by never allowing him in anything else, than it is to obtain this mere formal obedience by a constant exercise of authority. By and by, when he is old enough, take the child into confidence. Let him know what a noble thing it is to be able to make himself do, in a minute, and brightly, the very thing he would rather not do. To secure this habit of obedience, the mother must exercise great self-restraint. She must never give a command which she does not intend to see carried out to the full. And she must not lay upon her children burdens grievous to be borne, of command heaped upon command. Law ensures liberty. The children who are trained to perfect obedience may be trusted with a good deal of liberty. They receive a few directions which they know they must not disobey, and, for the rest, they are left to learn how to direct their own actions, even at the cost of some small mishaps, and are not pestered with a perpetual fire of "do this" and "don't do that." End of Part 4, Chapter 7. Recording by Philip Gould.
Part 4, Chapter 8 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 4, Chapter 8, Truthfulness, etc. Read by Boat Harbor, Houston, Texas. It is unnecessary to say a word of the duty of truthfulness, but the training of the child in the habit of strict veracity is another matter, and one which requires delicate care and scrupulosity on the part of the mother. 3 causes of lying, all vicious. The vice of lying arises from 3 causes: carelessness in ascertaining the truth, carelessness in stating the truth, and a deliberate intention to deceive. That all 3 are vicious is evident from the fact that a man's character may be ruined by what is no more than a careless misstatement on the part of another. The speaker repeats a damaging remark without taking the trouble to sift it, or he repeats what he has heard or seen with so little care to deliver the truth that his statement becomes no better than a lie. Only one kind visited on children. Now, of the 3 kinds of lying, it is only, as a matter of fact, the third which is severely visited upon the child. The first and second he is allowed in. He tells you he has seen lots of spotted dogs in the town. He has really seen 2. That all the boys are collecting crusts. He knows of 3 who are doing so. That everybody says Jones is a sneak. The fact is he has heard Brown say so. These departures from strict veracity are on matters of such slight importance that the mother is apt to let them pass as the children's chatter. But indeed every such lapse is damaging to the child's sense of truth, a blade which easily loses its keenness of edge. Accuracy of statement. The mother who trains her child to strict accuracy of statement about things small and great fortifies him against temptations to the grosser forms of lying. He will not readily color a tale to his own advantage, suppress facts, equivocate, when the statement of the simple fact has become a binding habit, and when he has not been allowed to form the contrary vicious habit of playing fast and loose with words. Exaggeration and ludicrous embellishments. 2 forms of prevarication, very tempting to the child, will require great vigilance on the mother's part: that of exaggeration, and that of clothing a story with ludicrous embellishments. However funny a circumstance may be as described by the child, the ruthless mother must strip the tale of everything over and above the naked truth. For, indeed, a reputation for fastidiousness is dearly purchased by the loss of that dignity of character, in child or man, which accompanies the habit of strict veracity. It is possible, happily, to be humorous without any sacrifice of truth. Reverence, etc. As for reverence, consideration for others, respect for persons and property, I can only urge the importance of a sedulous cultivation of these moral qualities, the distinguishing marks of a refined nature, until they become the daily habits of the child's life, and the more because a self-assertive, aggressive, self-seeking temper is but too characteristic of the times we live in. Temper born in a child. I am anxious, however, to say a few words on the habit of sweet temper. It is very customary to regard temper as constitutional, that which is born in you, and is neither to be helped nor hindered. Oh, she is a good-tempered little soul, nothing puts her out. Oh, he has his father's temper. The least thing that goes contrary makes him fly into a passion, are the sorts of remarks we hear constantly. Not temper, but tendency. It is no doubt true that the children inherit a certain tendency to irascibility or to amiability, to fretfulness, discontentment, peevishness, sullenness, murmuring, and impatience, or to cheerfulness, trustfulness, good humour, patience, and humility. It is also true that upon the preponderance of any of these qualities, upon temper, that is, the happiness or wretchedness of child and man depends, as well as the comfort or misery of the people who live with him. We all know people possessed of integrity and of many excellent virtues, who make themselves intolerable to their belongings. The root of the evil is, not that these people were born sullen, or peevish, or envious, that might have been mended, but that they were permitted to grow up in these dispositions. Here, if anywhere, the power of habit is invaluable. It rests with the parents to correct the original twist, all the more so if it is from them the child gets it, and to send their child into the world blessed with an even, happy temper, inclined to make the best of things, to look on the bright side, to impute the best and kindest motives to others, and to make no extravagant claims on his own account. Fertile source of ugly tempers. And this because the child is born with no more than certain tendencies. Parents must correct tendency by new habit of temper. It is by force of habit that a tendency becomes a temper, and it rests with the mother to hinder the formation of ill tempers, to force that of good tempers. Nor is it difficult to do this while the child's countenance is an open book to his mother, and she reads the thoughts of his heart before he is aware of them himself. Remembering that every envious, murmuring, discontented thought leaves a track in the very substance of the child's brain for such thoughts to run in again and again. That this track, this rut, so to speak, is ever widening and deepening with the traffic in ugly thoughts. The mother's care is to hinder at the outset the formation of any such track. She sees into her child's soul, sees the evil temper in the act of rising. Now is her opportunity. Change the child's thoughts. Let her change the child's thoughts before ever the bad temper has had time to develop into conscious feeling, much less act. Take him out of doors, send him to fetch or carry, tell him or show him something of interest. In a word, give him something else to think about, but all in a natural way and without letting the child perceive that he is being treated. As every fit of sullenness leaves place in the child's mind for another fit of sullenness to succeed it, so every fit averted by the mother's tact tends to obliterate the evil traces of former sullen tempers. At the same time, the mother is careful to lay down a highway for the free course of all sweet and genial thoughts and feelings. I have been offering suggestions, not for a course of intellectual and moral training, but only for the formation of certain habits, which should be, as it were, the outworks of character. Even with this limited program, I have left unnoticed many matters fully as important as those touched upon. In the presence of an embarrassment of riches, it has been necessary to adopt some principle of selection, and I have thought it well to dwell upon considerations which do not appear to me to have their full weight with educated parents, rather than upon those of which every thoughtful person recognizes the force. End of Part 4, Chapter 8.